Hi everyone, Derived Energy, and today I will be um, having a debate with Peter Singer, who published an article in the New York Times called "Should This Be the Last Generation?" And this is the philosopher that, to be serious, directed anybody interested in antinatalism to, and it's just like 2 pages long, well, 2 and a bit, but the last page are just questions that he asks at the end of his article, and I'm going to read it out and dissect it. So he says, have you ever thought about whether to have a child? Myself personally, not seriously, no. If so, what factors entered into your decision? Was it whether having children would be good for you? Well, people who defend natalism, they couch the act of procreation in terms of what they want. I want, so it's selfish. Was it whether having children would be good for you, your partner, and others close to the possible child, such as children you may already have, or perhaps your parents? So again, these are all people who already exist, who will be affected by the presence of another sentient self-reflexive manifestation of energy on the planet. So it's not about the future interests of the child. For most people contemplating reproduction, those are the dominant questions. Exactly, he's acknowledging that it's not the child, the person you're bringing into existence. That's not the person who you're thinking about in any kind of depth when you're justifying procreation. Some may also think about the desirability of adding to the strain that the nearly 7 billion people already here are putting on our planet's environment. Well, it's not the planet's environment so much that we need to be worried about, it's our own flesh and blood, coming into the world, reproducing, creating a new life, and then them suffering, unnecessary pain, suffering, and an inevitable death, to gratify the needs of the parents or any siblings or the grandparents of the new child. Most of those who consider that question probably do so because they have some reason to fear that a child's life would be especially difficult. For example, if they have a family history of a devastating illness, physical or mental, that cannot yet be detected prenatally. Well, I don't think you should only stop to think about whether procreation is a good or a bad idea just because you have an incredible fear that something terrible is going to happen to your child. I mean, the Benatarian asymmetry clearly shows that any pain or suffering that's experienced by your new child is gratuitous, because if you hadn't brought them into existence, they wouldn't have been deprived of anything. So you've given them something that they didn't need, and included in that whole package is the inevitable pain, suffering and death that they will experience as a result of being brought into the world. Something they had no say in. So it's an imposition, and procreation is a selfish and aggressive act. All this suggests that we think it is wrong to bring into the world a child whose prospects for a happy, healthy life are poor. Yeah, I mean, most people would not get a pat on the back if they said, well, I'm going to have a child, but I know that it's very likely to have a very uncomfortable, undesirable life, but I'm going to do that anyway. I mean, you wouldn't pat them on the back if they said something like that. But we don't usually think the fact that a child is likely to have a happy, healthy life is a reason for bringing the child into existence. It's been a bit vague here. He should have said something along the lines of, we don't usually think the fact that a child is likely to have a happy, healthy life is a reason for bringing the child into existence for its own sake. So he wasn't very clear about that. This has come to be known among philosophers as the asymmetry, and it is not easy to justify. So it's not easy to justify procreation in light of this asymmetry, because this asymmetry shows that, well, you know the asymmetry already, I'm not going to continually rephrase the implications of the asymmetry. But rather than go into the explanations usually proffered and why they fail, so here he's acknowledging that the counter-arguments against the Benatarian asymmetry, all the usual ones fail. But rather than go into the explanations usually proffered and why they fail, I want to raise a related question. So he's just completely dodging around the asymmetry here, and he's going to go on a tangent. I want to raise a related problem. How good does life have to be to make it reasonable to bring a child into the world? This is a bit of a rhetorical question here. I mean, it's completely avoided coming to grips with the asymmetry and the fact that we are all harmed by coming into existence, and he's not going to acknowledge that in this article. He's just going to dodge the issue, the main issue here with the Benatarian asymmetry, and he's going to couch the argument in terms of a continuing life debate instead of a starting life debate, which is very frustrating as an antinatalist because it's against natalism, it's against procreation. So that's where the ethical question should start. It should start before you have the child. It shouldn't be looking around people and looking around at people on the planet and making subjective decisions about whether it would be better for them to commit suicide or something. Is the standard of life experienced by most people in developed nations today good enough to make this decision unproblematic in the absence of specific knowledge that a child will have a severe genetic disease or other problem? It doesn't matter how good somebody's life is, even the happiest person in the world still experiences some pain and suffering, and they will die, so that's all gratuitous. So no life is worth starting for its own sake. If there were no future generations, there would be nothing for us to feel guilty about. No, there would be absolutely nothing for us to feel guilty about, because we would not be imposing pain, suffering and death on anybody in the future, and we wouldn't be depriving any future generations of happiness. So there'd be absolutely nothing wrong with that scenario, and there'd be nothing to feel guilty about. And he's just said there would be nothing to feel guilty about, and then he asks, is there anything wrong with this scenario? But he's just said there would be absolutely nothing for us to feel guilty about. So if there's absolutely nothing for us to feel guilty about, then how can there be anything wrong with that scenario? He talks about Schopenhauer, and then he says Schopenhauer's pessimism has had few defenders over the past 2 centuries. But I think it's a common theme, you know, if you study a bit of anthropology, that in all cultures there have been people who have recognised the fact that life can be intolerable, you know, and it's composed of suffering as well as pleasure and happiness and joy, and people throughout history have questioned the value of existence. You know, scattered throughout history there have been thinkers who have, you know, questioned the actual value of being born and coming into existence. In his arresting titled book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, there is one of his arguments trades on something like the asymmetry noted earlier. To bring into existence someone who will suffer is, Benatar argues, to harm that person, but to bring into existence someone who will have a good life is not to benefit him or her. So he's given a really brief description of the asymmetry, but he's not making it clear at all. He's just vague in the way he explains the asymmetry. The reason it's not a benefit to bring somebody into existence to experience what would subjectively be termed by many people as a good life is because you're not depriving anybody if you don't bring them into existence. So you need to use the word deprive and deprivation when you're talking about the asymmetry, but he doesn't, and that's the key word, deprivation of happiness. You cannot be deprived if you don't come into existence. But he's not explaining this. He's just vaguely, outlining the theory without using the key word of deprivation. To bring into existence someone who will suffer is, Benatar argues, to harm that person, but to bring into existence someone who will have a good life is not to benefit him or her. Few of us would think it right to inflict severe suffering on an innocent child, even if that were the only way in which we could bring many other children into the world. Yeah, that's right. If somebody said, right, you have to torture this kid, and if you do that, 10 trillion zillion happy people will suddenly magically materialise on the planet Neptune, then you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. Unless you're like the skeptical heretic or some animal like that. Where am I? Yes, everyone will suffer to some extent. Well, yeah, everyone will suffer to some extent. Everybody watching this video has suffered to some extent. And if our species continues to reproduce, we can be sure that some future children will suffer severely. Yeah, absolutely. The longer the human race continues, then the more people will be seriously suffer. This is irrefutable. You just have to look. In the newspapers to verify this. Hence, continued reproduction will harm some children severely, and it will harm everybody to some extent, and it will give everybody who's come into existence a death sentence. He's not saying these things, but he should, if he wants to represent David Benatar's arguments fairly, which he obviously doesn't, and benefit none. Benatar also argues that human lives are in general much less good than we think they are. While there's the Pollyanna bias, the optimism bias. We spend most of our lives with unfulfilled desires. Yeah, I wanted to be a pop star, so that's an unfulfilled desire. And the occasional satisfactions that are all most of us can achieve, and are insufficient to outweigh these prolonged but negative states. If we think this is a tolerable state of affairs, it is because we are, in Benatar's view, victims of the illusion of Pollyannism. Well, it has actually been verified. I think I might make a separate video on the optimism bias, but it's a common phenomenon in human psychology. People overestimate the good and underestimate the bad, and they have overly optimistic expectations of what they're doing now and how that will affect the future, and they remember positive events more clearly than they do past negative events. It's like the brain kind of dims our memories of painful and suffering states of mind that we've experienced in the past, and amplifies the good, positive, happy moments and stages in our lives. Right. If we could see our lives objectively, we would see that they are not something we should inflict on anyone. Absolutely. If you could see our lives objectively, i.e., we've been injected with a need that we didn't need to have. We're all going to die. We all experience some pain and suffering throughout our lives. Many of us severely, or some of us severely. The subjectivity enters into that, of course, but we can all unproblematically say that we're all exposed to pain and suffering at points during our life. And if we don't bring anybody into existence, there's no one being deprived of happiness. So it's imposing something that is malignantly useless, as Thomas Ligotti says, because you're not gaining anything that you needed before you were born, in terms of happiness and stuff, and you find yourself in a predicament where you're going to die, and you know that you're going to feel pain and suffering, in your life. So why would you want to inflict that on anybody? If you could see that in an objective way, then you're not going to want to have children. The idea of having a child makes me feel sick, because it would be imposing sentience on somebody He doesn't need it because they don't exist, you know. So, but, I mean, in terms of thinking about the ramifications of having a child, you're actually giving somebody a death sentence. And then you see people and they're like, oh, it's the gift of life and everything, but this is just some twisted insanity that we have a genetical predisposition to have as a species. Because otherwise, if we didn't have this insanity and saw things more objectively and clearly, then the human race would be extinct by now. Here is a thought experiment to test our attitudes to this view. Most thoughtful people are extremely concerned about climate change. Some stop eating meat or flying abroad on vacation in order to reduce their carbon footprint, but the people who will be most severely harmed by climate change have not yet been conceived. If there were to be no future generations, there would be much less for us to feel guilty about. I mean, this is it, you see. When people talk about climate change, then they're anticipating the suffering that will be incurred to future people who don't exist yet, you know, and they're anticipating the suffering that will be caused to future people. So they're making moral judgments and they're anticipating the potential harm that will come to people who may be born in the future, and they're using that to guide their current moral behaviour, even though that person hasn't come into existence. And it's the same with procreation. You can anticipate the consequences of bringing a child into the world and adjust your behaviour accordingly in relation to a possible scenario in the future. So when we talk about anticipating the future child's welfare before making a decision to procreate, it's exactly the same sort of reasoning and moral reasoning that the people employ when they argue that we should be making an effort to preserve the environment. But people don't get on their high horse and say, oh, it's ridiculous to not damage the planet for future generations. They don't rubbish that idea, but then they rubbish the idea of, you know, why are you worried about people who don't even exist yet? That's logically incoherent, you know, that's ridiculous. Now I can see through all this. I can see that people are mistaken on this. So why don't we make ourselves the last generation on Earth? If we would all agree to have ourselves sterilised, then no sacrifices would be required. We could party our way into extinction. Well, there's not even any need for sterilisation. I mean, there's condoms and there's the pill, and and they're pretty robust shields against conceiving a child. So you don't need to go to hospital and have your private parts snipped. Of course, it would be impossible to get agreement on universal sterilisation, but just imagine that we could. Okay, so this is what philosophy is about in a way. It's generating thought experiments like this one, so you can get clearly at the issue. Then is there anything wrong with this scenario? Right, so everyone wants to get sterilised, or agrees to get sterilised. Is there anything wrong with the human race becoming extinct? No. Even if we take a less pessimistic view of human existence than Benatar, but how can you do that if you're going to be intellectually honest? I mean, it's logical inductive reasoning. No pain and suffering, and no death, and no deprivation of happiness. If you don't have a child, look at planet Mars. Planet Mars is absolutely fine the way it is. So why would you want to take a less pessimistic stance on it? Everyone's harmed by being brought into existence. We can get rid of, we could still defend it because it makes us better off. For one thing, we can get rid of all that guilt about what we are doing to future generations. Yeah, guilt. I mean, I'm not going to have any children, and when I die, I'm, at least as far as procreation goes, I will be able to look myself in the mirror and know that there's no blood on my hands. This sentience existence thing in a meaningless, immoral universe is not something that I imposed on anybody. In fact, I spoke out against it. So I really think that I have been and am doing my part on this issue. I'm increasing consciousness. These issues need to be discussed, they need to be explored, not just just conveniently swept under the carpet because people don't have the intellectual honesty and integrity needed, to look the human condition square in the face and see that it's something that would best not be. And it doesn't make anyone worse off because there won't be anyone else to be worse off. Yeah, human extinction, no human beings. Is a world with people in it better than one without? Let's decide what we do to other species. That's a different issue. Let's assume that the choice is between a world like ours and one with no sentient beings in it at all. So now he's adjusting the parameters of the thought experiment. So everyone agrees that the human race should become extinct and everyone's prepared to get sterilized and there are no animals that will be affected. If the human race becomes extinct, there will just be a complete lack of sentience all across the planet. And everyone's going to agree no one's rights will be violated, at least not in the rights of any existing people. Can non-existent people have a right to come into existence? How can a non-existent person have a right to come into existence? They won't be harmed and they won't be deprived of happiness. There's no motivation for them to come into existence, and they're not in a state of need where they're pining to come into existence. So why ascribe a right to them to come into existence? Is a right to be? What should somebody have a right to experience unnecessary pain, suffering, and death? What sort of right is that? The right should be in the other direction. It should be not to find yourself due to someone else's imposition on you, trapped in a body that is decaying and dying. I do think it would be wrong to choose the non-sentient universe. So it's just controlled for the animals. It's controlled for the disagreements that would inevitably occur. Not everyone is going to agree to global discontinuation of the human race. But in this thought experiment, he's controlled for all these variables, and he's still saying it would be wrong to choose the non-sentient universe. So it begs the question, why? And he says, in my judgment, for most people, life is worth living. So for life is worth living, because people are absolutely petrified of death and committing suicide. So life has to get incredibly gruesome before most people will consider taking their own life. So in a lot of cases, people are trapped between a rock and a hard place, But he's going away from the issue of starting life, i.e. a procreation ethics debate, about procreation, and he's transposed it into this life worth living argument. They're two totally different issues. Even if that is not yet the case, I am enough of an optimist to believe that should humans survive for another century or two, we will learn from our past mistakes and bring about a world in which there is far less suffering than there is now. So he's just basically saying that he's enough of an optimist to see an improvement, but everyone's harmed by coming into existence. He's not addressing that, and how can he's not justifying, he's not giving any logical or rational arguments here. He's just stating that he's an optimist, and therefore he sees things as the amount of suffering decreasing in the future. But even if it does decrease significantly, it's still unnecessary pain and suffering that you're inflicting on your own child. So it really doesn't make any sense to me. And moreover, I don't see any grounds for optimism regarding how much suffering is and will go on in the world in the next couple of centuries if we last that long. Look, war is a constant theme. How are you going to get over war? How are you going to stop people from fighting and killing each other in wars? You know, it doesn't. The technology, it magnifies flaws in human nature. So it's not some kind of anecdote. What's the word? Antidote for man's ills and the flaws in his psychology. And it's like, I mean, you know all the viruses and Trojans and that on the internet. Just imagine getting to a VR suite, you know, and someone playing around and putting some malicious software onto that VR suite. I mean, these things will happen. You're not going to be able to control for them. So that'll conclude this video.